Rima Makaryan is an Armenian American artist and 18-year-old immigrant rights activist. Her art and her work spans from California all the way to Armenia. She joins me today to discuss her passion for social justice in the United States and abroad, and her recent trip to Armenia, where she worked with and documented the stories of refugees displaced after the 2020 war in that region. Hi, and thank you very much for coming on, Rima. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So you were not born in the United States. Tell us a little bit about your immigration story.
So my kind of immigration story is an interesting one. My family came to the US accidentally, to put it quite plainly. We applied for the green card just for fun because some other family friend had done it.
The green card lottery you're talking about.
Yes, the green card lottery. And the family that wanted to go didn't win, but we did. And so kind of on a whim, my parents decided that, the US would offer a better, future for me and my brother. And they decided to come here in 2010. So I moved here when I was around 8 years old, and I've been living in Santa Rosa, California since then.
What's your recollection of living in Armenia before you immigrated to the United States?
It's full of memories at my grandmother's house. It's full of memories of snow days and kind of going to school and the city and just those walks from, my grandmother's house to school and all of those things. So just bits and pieces of a really happy, blissful life.
Were your parents happy in Armenia as well?
My parents were happy to a certain extent. My mother worked as an OBGYN. She was very well respected. My father worked in a bank. But because of the corruption that was in Armenia, neither of my parents could earn an honest living. So even as a doctor, my mother did not earn enough money because she chose to do things honestly and didn't take bribes and other things like that. So it was a very difficult system to be successful in and be honest at the same time. So that's one of the big reasons that they decided to come to the US.
I assume you didn't speak any English when you came.
No, I did not speak any English. I knew the English alphabet, and that was probably it. I came here and I moved into a community that was actually hugely, immigrant for the most part, but, they were mostly Mexican Americans and other Hispanic populations. So it was kind of like a double culture shock. You come to the US expecting to be immersed in kind of, the American English culture, but then you're immersed in a completely different one that you were not, expecting at all. Surprisingly, I related a lot more to that culture than to kind of the US American culture.
Why do you say that? Why did you relate more?
The family is the biggest part. And I think how closely connected and close-knit they were was a lot more relatable to me than kind of the American lifestyle.
And were there many Armenians in that community too, or was mostly
No, I think I know just about every Armenian who lives in the city, and that's like 3 families. So we're basically one giant Armenian family. That's how Armenians function. We just find each other and become one big one. Family.
So were you happy to move here? Was it an unhappy experience at first?
It was definitely unhappy because as a family, we were really tied to my grandparents, and, we really didn't know anyone here except, my aunt's mother-in-law, and that was about it. So we were kind of the very first people to move to the country and completely isolated from everyone and everything. Didn't really know how to find resources in the US at all. So it was definitely difficult in the beginning.
You're an artist and you're incorporating your art into immigration rights. Tell me how that all came about.
So I'll start with the art piece because that came before the activism. When I moved to the US, I did not have friends. I did not have anyone to turn to, and I had a lot of free time on my hands. And I think most of that time went to creating art and also writing at the same time. So I would write poetry in English to try to learn the language and kind of illustrated my poems on the side. So I think that's where my love for art really grew. I drew as a child before that, but I think it was during that time of isolation that, my art really flourished.
I'm actually looking at one of your first murals right behind you, right?
Yes, this is one of those first pieces. This is after I'd kind of dived into social justice more, because this is definitely a political piece. When I started high school, that was, I think, when Donald Trump first became president. And the first thing that I remember from his presidency was kind of the threat that he put DACA under. And kind of as a young immigrant, that really resonated with me. It made me realize that there's a very small difference between me and the people who were being, placed in a dangerous situation as a result of this policy change. The only difference being that I had the privilege to come here legally and they did not. So I think it was that specific policy, what happened to DACA, that really put me into the activist world. And when I really started to care about social justice on a deep level, I live in a community where, majority were people of color, majority were Latino, Latinx. And so I could definitely see the impact firsthand. We had kind of staff at our school who were DACA recipients themselves, students who were DACA recipients themselves. It didn't feel like something that was really far away. It felt like was right in my own backyard.
When did all of this happen?
I don't remember where the idea came from them specifically, but I recalled, brainstorming about ways to communicate, what was really going on and to kind of talk about the human side, because I was really tired of political discussions where people just used really, really toxic language, and it was just a very toxic culture in general. So I wanted to find a way to cut through the noise, cut through the sound bites, and really kind of hone in on the human side of the experience. And that's when this piece kind of was born.
And you founded the so-called Monarch Project. Tell me what that is.
So the Monarch Project kind of happened while I was painting this mural. We had a bunch of extra volunteers and I didn't know what to do with them. So I laid out pieces of fabric and they just painted monarch butterflies. And I saw that it was a symbol that resonated with a lot of different people for different reasons. For some of them, it was about immigration. For others, it was purely about chasing your dreams. And so I had seen that whatever I had started with this project was something that could be taken to the next level. And that's kind of when I founded the Monarch Project and I decided to spread this message of kind of unity and, again, cutting through the noise and using powerful symbols, beautiful symbols, to connect people.
What is the Scape Mural Project?
So the Scape Mural Project started after the George Floyd protests and the kind of Black Lives Matter movement, after it had revived. And I think our community was looking again for another outlet to talk about the issue. And I was approached by a group of really powerful, amazing women who wanted to create this mural project. And they didn't have any experience with painting murals or, anything of this kind, but it was just a purely people who were really, really inspired and empowered to do something. And so they reached out to me and we started to work together to create a series of murals kind of around empowering all groups of people.
Each of your projects is quite interactive. You want to tell us a little bit about it?
Well, there's different ways that people can interact with my pieces. For one, it's the actual creation process. These pieces are volunteer run for the most part. So we have at least 20, 50 people working on the project at a time. It really allows for the community to be fully immersed in the process and to feel like they have a voice in whatever movement that we're trying to support. So it empowers people to kind of take matters in their own hands and to see something that they've created on their own walls of the city.
You were recently in Armenia working on a project called The Forgotten Faces of Artsakh. Tell us about that.
So I think it was September and October when this war broke out in Armenia.
Well, let's have a little background. There was a war in Armenia between Azerbaijan and the ethnic Armenians over a slice of land. And there was a lot of displaced people, and it doesn't make the news a lot, but it was a horrible situation what was going on there. And you went to and document this, almost being a teenage war correspondent. What made you want to go back to Armenia and document this?
I just couldn't sit still is, I think, the best answer. When this was going on, it did not feel right to be here in the US and kind of watching that unveil passively. So I really had no choice but to go, for me personally. So I really wanted to make sure that this story was not forgotten. And I think as a child, one of the things that really embedded that kind of activist spirit in me was my parents telling me about the Armenian Genocide and always feeling like it was forgotten, that it was ignored, and that no one was telling the story. And I would always tell myself, like, if I was alive during that time, there's no way people wouldn't have heard about this. Like, I would make sure that people knew. This was, like, as a child, my fantasy. And then the war broke out in October and September, and I realized that this was kind of the equivalent of that in my time. So I had to go and I had to make sure that this was not forgotten by the world.
What did you think as an Armenian here in the United States of America, where there's a brutal war going on in your home country? You don't really read or hear about it in the United States.
Right. I mean, it's unfortunately a feeling that we're very used to. So I was not surprised or shocked, maybe a little bit disappointed, but I think at this point when you're so used to kind of being brushed aside, you just kind of accept it. But of course, there's still that anger and that sadness that those histories are being lost and that this injustice is taking place without anyone knowing. But also, understanding that it was a chaotic time for the entire world, but also kind of thinking about kind of relativities in terms of problems in the world and always thinking that, okay, but my problem is more important than yours. Why are you not paying attention to the destruction that is taking place in this home country? So it was a mix of anger, understanding, and disappointment.
How long were you in Armenia?
I was there for about 5 weeks.
Were you there during the war or after the war?
I was there just after the war. I decided to go. I was ready to go during the war, but By the time I had, bought my tickets and finished my first quarter of college, the war had ended. But the fallout of the war was, I think, just as intense as the war itself. It was a time of crisis in the country, a time of grief, and a time where people were really starting to understand what just happened, because before, I think you're kind of lost in the shock and you're not really fully comprehending the gravity of the situation.
Did you ever feel that your life was in danger when you went back there?
I think flying in was a little bit nerve-wracking, because even if the war was officially complete, there were still tensions on both sides. Troops hadn't totally left and Russian peacekeepers weren't in place yet. But my family was very, very protective, and they didn't let me go into the places where I would really, really be in danger. I had my whole trip planned to go to Artsakh, and at the last minute, a hostage crisis broke out, and they decided that would not be rational for me to go, unfortunately.
So how were you able to gain access to document what you documented?
So I worked with the provisional government of Armenia, of Glory province, which is where I'm from. And I worked with the Women's and Children's Human Rights Protection Center of the kind of administrative government. And they kind of had records of where everyone was. And we were lucky enough to be able to visit all of them in their homes.
Let's watch a short clip from some of your interviews of the refugees from the recent war in Armenia.
Առավոտյան ժամը 7-ից այս վերթարետ կմփոցից։ Դե հենց շենքերի վրա ենք գցեցին շենքերի վրա, մենք հասցրեցինք գրկեցի երեխաների ժամը տանլկում։ Ճիշտ ասած միջև հիմա էլ հիշելուց այսպես արսափում եմ ես ոնց գտա ուժի մեջ որ կարած երեխաներից հանեմ։
Can you give a little background as you know it? And obviously, as Armenian, you have one opinion of what's going on. And I guess if we spoke to somebody from Azerbaijan or Turkey, which is, I think, on the side of Azerbaijan, they would have a different opinion. But can you give us, at least from your perspective, what is going on in the conflict?
So that is a history that dates back centuries, and I won't go that far back, and I'll sum it up like this. Armenia is the only Christian country in that region at the moment. It is surrounded by other Muslim states, and dating back to, the Armenian Genocide and before that, there have been huge tensions between those ethnic groups. There have been times of peace where you have bigger governments who have mediated the situation and kind of frozen these sentiments, but there has been so much bloodshed on both sides where each ethnic group regards the other as a complete enemy to a dehumanizing extent, I would say. And for Armenians, that comes from, again, the Armenian Genocide. It comes from the fact that we rarely, if ever, initiate conflict, and it's always people trying to destroy our culture, trying to take away our language and our religion, and us simply trying to defend that. So that's kind of where that comes from, the historical sentiment. Specifically, this situation is kind of a continuation of that over a very specific region, which is the Artsakh region or Nagorno-Karabakh. So there's two different names that you can call the same place. And it's a matter of principle more than anything to be able to call that land your own. For Armenians, it's about protecting the ethnic people who live in that area. For Azerbaijan, it's about claiming land that they believe is rightfully theirs because of policies enacted after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
So how many Armenian refugees are there right now as a result of this war? Do you know?
At the moment, I do not know because there's been so much changements and people moving and going, leaving the country even. But I think the conflict itself displaced 150,000 Armenians from their homes. And I think we lost about 4,000 or 5,000 lives.
And even if their homes are still standing, I would assume that a lot are afraid to go back, that they may be killed.
Definitely. Some lands are simply not, they're completely destroyed, so there's nothing there left. And other lands have been taken by Azerbaijan. And the legal policy is that they can fully return and they can continue living their lives with other Azeris. But that is simply not the case. I think any Armenian who stepped foot in Azerbaijan at the moment would probably be dead within the first day at most.
Where are they living now? How are they surviving?
Essentially what has happened is different provinces in Armenia have taken these families under their wing, and they've kind of helped them find different forms of housing. Some people have been lucky enough to have relatives that they can move in with in Armenia, but for the most part, people are living in kind of, extra homes here and there. Some people are living in kind of like a former orphanage, so there's 10 different families living in one building, kind of every family to a single room, essentially. And the hardest part, I think, is the winter. at the moment. Armenia's winters are very, very intense and very, very cold. And for the most part, people stay warm by burning wood. And so there's constantly that fear of not having enough of that or freezing overnight and things like that.
Now, you met some people I want to specifically talk about. For example, Inga and Maroid. They were 13-year-old and mother. Tell us about what you learned about them.
They were at the orphanage, so this was one of the many different families living under one roof. And, I was going around from interview to interview, and I came across this family. And most families are pretty open to me filming them, asking them questions, things like that. But this particular one was not open to that at all. In fact, it was the 13-year-old boy who was strictly against this idea. He would flinch every time I pointed the camera at him or anything like that. And what struck me the most before I go into kind of their story is kind of the pride that this 13-year-old boy had and wanting to retain that pride and not wanting to appear like a victim or wanting to appear weak and to not be portrayed in this point in his life. And he kept talking about, I asked him, do you want to go to school? He's like, I want to go to school back home. And that clearly wasn't a possibility. And we asked him again, like, that's not possible. And he just kind of, his voice cracked a little bit. He said, no, I want to go home. So that was a very touching moment.
Can you picture yourself in the shoes? Because, 13, you're 18. So that was only 5 years ago for you. Had you not immigrated to America, and maybe you could have been in that little boy's position?
I can definitely picture myself. And I think some of it comes back to, the way that we immigrated as well. I mean, for me, obviously, I knew I had a home to return to when we came to the US, but just kind of leaving everything behind, this idea of not being able to go back to what you believe is your home is something that is completely earth-shattering, and it almost creates like a cognitive dissonance. Like, you don't really understand how this is possible. You've spent your entire life here, and it's like shattering your entire reality.
And what did you learn from the mother? She was in the orphanage with
That's
nowhere to house her family.
Right. And I loved her story in particular because I think it represented a lot of different stories, a lot of other stories that I came across. So this was the third time that Inga had to kind of leave her home, and not this home, but different homes. She fled after a different massacre in Baku, Azerbaijan. And like I said, there've been so many different conflicts between the two different people. I think it was back in a couple of decades ago that there was a huge massacre in Baku, Azerbaijan, and Armenians were forced to flee that home. And then when she came to Artsakh, another conflict broke out and her home was completely destroyed and she had to start over again. And so this was the third time that this woman had to start from scratch, from nothing, and having to rebuild another life. And I could tell that at this point she had kind of lost that spirit, or at least in that moment. I think a lot of these people have a strength that I can't describe, being so used to living in a zone where you're constantly under threat, and they have never been afraid to want to rebuild again. Never. A lot of families were saying that even if there's nothing left in that land, just let me go back and I will rebuild my home from scratch. But Inga was telling me that she would never cross kind of the pathway to go to Qarabağ again, to Artsakh again. She said never, 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 never. So that's the story of Inga and Noray.
Do you think that the conflict is more an ethnic conflict or a religious conflict between Muslims and Christians?
I would say it's more ethnic than religious. I think the religion kind of comes with that. I think that's one of the root causes it started in the first place, just because, again, Armenia is just a minority in that region and wanting to retain that culture. And also in the fact that they refuse to change their religion. They were told you can live if you convert. And they did not agree to that. Or if you forget your language, we'll let you live. And again, that was not something that Armenians were going to do ever. So I would say it's started with religion, but now it's evolved into kind of a historical precedent, if that makes sense. And kind of remembering that history and saying that I could never look you in the eye without remembering the death of my great-grandparents.
And you met some other people as well. You met a soldier, Hovo.
That's right, yes.
How old was Hovo?
Hovo was 18. Hovo was actually my childhood friend, my family friend. Our fathers were very, very close. He's my age. He's 18 years old, but he's no longer a child in any shape or form. My world and his world cannot be compared in any shape or form. Tell
me what you learned. What did he share with you?
He shared with me, I think one of the things that struck me was kind of the first moment that he knew the war had started. He was there for 3 days. He was, in Armenia, there's a mandatory draft. So all 18-year-old boys at some point have to go and serve for 2 years in the military. And he was sent off to that region specifically, Artsakh. And so he had been there for 3 days when, the conflict erupted. And so here we have an 18-year-old kid who, just showed up to this new place. And now he has to go to the trenches, quite literally go to the trenches and fight.
Did he describe the horrors of what he experienced and saw?
He told me about the days where he lost his best friend to the conflict. He told me about the days where, he would simply have to kind of pretend he was playing a game and kind of dehumanize his enemy in order to be able to, fight against them and know that it's either me or you, and I'm gonna choose me. That's just how it has to be.
And you had also met an older man.
Savedisyan.
Right. And he talked about his grandchildren. And tell us about what you learned from him.
I visited his home. It was a very cold, kind of windy day. And so we go into this little house and up on a hill in the middle of nowhere. And then we have this entire multi-generational family. And I think that's something that a lot of Americans might not be used to. But we have kind of the great-grandparent, the children, and the grandchildren all in one scene together. And so as we were interviewing, this man was silent the entire time. But I could see kind of tears welling up. And eventually I turned to him and decided to speak to him. And so he spoke in the thickest kind of Qarabağ and Artsakh accent ever. And there's so many different dialects that I could barely understand what he was saying. And I had to have someone translate to me parts of it. But he spoke about his homeland, which is Shushi, which is one of the regions that we have now lost and no longer belong to Armenia. He spoke about the nature and kind of how connected they were to the land itself, the physical land, and what that meant to him. And the line that struck me the most was, I asked him, what does your homeland mean to you? And he said, gold. It's my gold. It's my dear. It's my beloved.
What are you going to do with all these videos?
The videos, the photos, the short stories, all of them, they are meant to be shared. They are meant to be heard and seen. So my goal now is to make sure that as many people as possible know about what happened and that they can see these photos and really understand what is going on, to hear their voices, to hear their stories.
Is there a place that we can go right now?
Yes, there is my website, Forgotten Faces of Artsakh. On that website, you can find the full collection of stories organized by families and themes, and you can also donate. And that is kind of the final piece. We're starting a sustainable development project to help these families really on the long term and not just, first aid.
And you're also bringing the Monarch Project, your mural project, to Armenia.
Also another interesting marriage between, I guess my two passions. A lot of the villages in Armenia and, where these displaced people are living have zero access to any kinds of arts education. And, youth grow up immersed in a world that only has to do with agriculture and just their own little bubble of their remote village. So what we're trying to do is to really make sure that, children have options and kids have options as they're growing up. And so we'll be sending kits to Armenia, little art kits, along with video tutorials to teach them how to paint monarch butterflies and other things like that, to make sure that everyone has access to arts education, even remote villages in the middle of nowhere.
Where can we find out more about the so-called Monarch Project?
It's www.socoimm.org, and you can see the full gallery of all the pieces that I've done. We have a bunch of posters up that you guys can purchase, t-shirts, all kinds of merch. And all of those proceeds go directly towards creating more public art projects in Sonoma County, and I guess now in Armenia.
It's amazing what you've done as an 18-year-old. You've done more as an 18-year-old who immigrated here as an 8-year-old than people have done in a whole lifetime. So it's just amazing. You're also a freshman at Stanford, right?
That's right.
Tell us, what is your American dream?
My American dream is for everyone to be able to fully participate in the pursuit of happiness. And I think that's a very kind of basic concept, but I think it means a lot of different things. I think to simply have the freedom to live your life in a way where you're not in fear. And I think that's a very, very basic minimum, but just to be able to have the opportunity to chase your happiness to the fullest extent, whatever that might mean.
Rima Makaryan, thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciate you spending some time here on Brad Show Live.
Thank you for having me.